They didn't knock. They didn't ask. 3 black SUVs rolled onto our land just after sunrise, tires crushing the dirt road my grandfather had carved with his own hands. Men in pressed shirts stepped out first. Then the HOA president, clipboard tight in her grip, smile sharp like she'd already won. She didn't waste time. "This property is now under HOA jurisdiction," she said, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. Phones were already up. People were watching. Then she pointed past me, toward the barn. "We'll need the keys." Before I could speak, she added, "And the cattle. According to our revised survey, they're no longer yours." My chest tightened. The land was bad enough. But the cattle? Generations of work. Bloodlines my grandfather protected like family. She took one step closer. "House keys too." I laughed, once. Out of shock. Out of disbelief. "You can't just take everything," I said. Her smile faded. "Your grandfather is gone," she replied coldly. "His rules died with him." That's when I understood this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a takeover. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my grandfather had prepared for this moment. And his final words weren't meant for me. They were meant for a courtroom. Before we continue, drop your city or state in the comments. I want to see how far this story reaches. And if you believe truth should always outrun greed, like and subscribe. This land wasn't just property. It was proof of a life lived the right way. My grandfather bought it when nobody wanted it, dry soil, broken fencing, and no promises. He worked it into something real. Pastures wide enough for cattle to roam without fear. A barn built board by board. Gates that didn't lock because trust was still a thing back then. He hated paperwork, but he respected it. Every deed, every survey, every tax receipt was sealed in plastic and filed by year. He used to say, "Land doesn't get stolen with guns anymore. It gets stolen with pens." The HOA came decades later, creeping outward from a polished neighborhood that didn't belong out here. Perfect lawns. Identical mailboxes. Rules written by people who'd never touched dirt. Grandpa ignored them. Not out of arrogance, but because his land was older than their bylaws. Letters started arriving. Then warnings. Then friendly notices about boundary adjustments and compliance reviews. Grandpa never responded. He just marked his lines again. Stronger. Clearer. When he passed, the funeral wasn't even over before the HOA started circling. Survey flags appeared where none had been before. Neighbors whispered about expansion plans. About roads that needed widening. About cattle being out of place. They thought the land was vulnerable now. They thought legacy died with the man. What they didn't understand was this: Grandpa didn't just leave me land. He left me a fight they were never ready for. The first letter arrived 3 days after the funeral. Not a condolence. Not even a formality. Just a thick envelope stamped HOA compliance notice. Inside were phrases that felt carefully chosen to sound legal without actually meaning anything: boundary reassessment, community alignment, non-conforming land use. At the bottom was a deadline. 7 days. I ignored it. Grandpa would have. That's when the fine started. $100 a day for unauthorized grazing. $200 for unapproved structures, meaning the barn that had stood longer than the HOA itself. They claimed my cattle violated community standards: too many, too visible, too industrial for their vision. Then came the surveys. One morning I woke up to bright orange flags stabbed into the soil like warning markers. They ran straight through the pasture, cutting off a third of the land. Right through the fence line Grandpa had reinforced every spring. Right through the path the cattle used to reach water. I pulled them out. Every single one. By sunset, they were back, doubled. When I called the HOA office, the woman on the line spoke like she was reading from a script. Calm. Polite. Untouchable. These boundaries have been updated, she said. Resistance will be documented. Documented. Like I was a problem to be managed. A week later, a pickup truck I didn't recognize parked near the barn. Two men stepped out with clipboards and ear tags. They said they were contracted by the HOA to inventory livestock. I stood in front of the gate. "You don't touch my cattle," I told them. One of them shrugged. "Take it up with the board." That night, the shared access gate was locked. My lock was gone. Replaced with a shiny new one stamped with the HOA logo. I drove to the president's house the next morning. She didn't invite me in. Just stood on her porch, arms crossed, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "You're escalating things unnecessarily," she said. I laughed again. That same hollow laugh. "You locked me out of my own land." She smiled. Temporary measure. At the next HOA meeting, they put my name on the agenda like I was a zoning issue. Neighbors I'd waved to for years wouldn't meet my eyes. The president stood up and spoke about community harmony and protecting property values. Then she said it. Some landowners believe they're above the rules because of history. A few people nodded. I stood to speak. She cut me off. "Please submit your concerns in writing." That's when I realized this wasn't about rules. It was about control. About seeing how far they could push before I broke. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy showed up, polite, uncomfortable. He said the HOA had reported a dispute and asked him to keep the peace. He didn't tell me to leave. He didn't take their side. But he didn't stop them either. That silence was louder than any threat. The ultimatum came in a certified letter. Turn over the land pending review. Surrender the cattle for relocation. Provide all keys to structures for inspection. Failure to comply would result in legal action. I sat at Grandpa's old desk that night, the wood worn smooth where his hands had rested for decades. I opened every drawer. Every folder. Deeds. Maps. Handwritten notes and margins only he could decipher. And for the first time since this started, doubt crept in. They had money. Lawyers. Influence. I had history, and a growing fear that history wasn't enough anymore. That's when I made the call. Not to the HOA. To a lawyer. And that's when things stopped being one-sided. The lawyer didn't say much when I told him everything. He listened. Took notes. Asked me to slow down when my voice started shaking. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and said only one thing. "Have they put anything in writing?" I slid the stack of letters across the desk. Fines. Notices. The ultimatum. He nodded. Good. They always get careless when they think they've already won. 2 days later, the HOA made their move. Contractors showed up just after dawn, the same hour they'd come for the land before. This time they had trucks, fencing equipment, and a crew leader who kept glancing at his phone like he was waiting for permission to breathe. They started unloading steel posts near the flagged boundary line. I called the lawyer. "Don't touch them," he said. "Let them touch first." By noon, the cattle were restless. The crew tried to herd them away from the pasture closest to the road. I stepped between them again. Voices rose. Someone threatened to call the sheriff. This time, the sheriff came with paperwork. Not an eviction. Not yet. Just a notice saying the HOA had filed a civil action claiming partial possession due to abandonment, noncompliance, and failure to maintain community standards. Abandonment. I stood there staring at the word like it might change if I looked long enough. My grandfather's land. Abandoned. The lawsuit hit a week later. The HOA sued for control of the disputed acreage, immediate access to all structures, and temporary custody of the cattle to prevent further violations. They framed it like concern. Like they were protecting something fragile. The first hearing was scheduled fast. Too fast. Walking into that courtroom felt like walking into a trap already set. The HOA president sat in the front row, legs crossed, whispering to her attorney. She didn't look at me, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't have to. Their lawyer spoke first. He talked about order, about rules, about how communities fall apart when exceptions are allowed. He called my land an anomaly, my cattle an operational risk. He said my grandfather's absence created a vacuum the HOA had a duty to fill. When it was our turn, my lawyer stood slowly. He didn't argue. Not yet. He asked for time. Time to review historical records. Time to examine county filings. Time to understand the full scope of ownership. The judge agreed, setting a full hearing for 30 days later. Outside the courtroom, the HOA president finally spoke to me. "You should have just cooperated," she said quietly. "This didn't have to be ugly." I looked at her and realized something terrifying. She believed that. The next few weeks were a blur of pressure. More letters. More fines. Rumors that the cattle would be seized any day now. A neighbor told me the HOA was already discussing what to do with the land once it was resolved. At night, I walked the pasture, listening to the cattle breathe, wondering how much longer I could protect them with nothing but stubbornness. Then the lawyer called me into his office again. He had spread documents across the table. Old ones. Yellowed. Hand-drawn lines instead of computer printouts. "These are your grandfather's surveys," he said. "Filed directly with the county. Not the HOA." I felt a flicker of hope, and then fear. "Is it enough?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked a question that caught me completely off guard. "Did your grandfather leave a will?" "Yes," I said. "Standard stuff. Property, livestock, the house." He shook his head slowly. "I don't mean a will," he said. "I mean, did he leave instructions?" I thought about the desk. The folders. The notes in the margins. The way Grandpa never threw anything away. "I don't know," I admitted. The lawyer stood and opened a cabinet. He pulled out a thin, sealed envelope. My name was written on it, in Grandpa's handwriting. "This was filed with the county clerk," he said. "Not as a will. As an affidavit. To be opened only if ownership was ever challenged." My throat went dry. "We can't use it yet," he continued. "Not until the hearing. But when we do..." He paused. "They won't be able to pretend this is a misunderstanding anymore." For the first time since the HOA SUVs rolled onto my land, I slept through the night. Because I finally understood something they didn't. This fight wasn't about who was louder. It was about who had prepared for silence. And my grandfather had been very, very quiet. The morning of the full hearing, the courtroom felt heavier than usual. The air conditioning hummed low, but it couldn't mask the tension. The HOA president sat poised, as if she had rehearsed this day for decades. Their lawyers carried their files like armor. I carried my grandfather's envelope. My lawyer carried the calm he always radiated, like he already knew what the outcome would be. No one had opened the envelope yet. That would come later. But even before that moment, the subtle shifts in the room were noticeable. The bailiff called the court to order. The judge scanned the room, noting the large attendance, neighbors, a few local journalists, and people whose curiosity had brought them just to witness this unusual showdown between a man and an overreaching HOA. The HOA lawyer began their opening statement. They spoke about community standards, compliance, abandonment, and operational risk. Each word aimed to strip away decades of family work, to frame the land, the cattle, and the house as problems rather than legacies. They didn't notice the glances in the crowd, people shifting uncomfortably as the story unfolded. When it was our turn, my lawyer rose slowly. Instead of attacking, he asked for one simple thing. "May we submit evidence that predates all HOA claims?" The judge agreed. That's when the envelope came out. It was Grandpa's handwriting, perfectly neat, yet impossible to ignore. The lawyer broke the seal, unfolded the pages, and read aloud. If they are reading this, it means the land I worked my life for is under threat. My family must know the truth. This property has never been part of any HOA. All surveys, all deeds, all county filings, these documents prove ownership and rights that cannot be overwritten. The cattle belong to my family. The structures belong to my family. Should anyone challenge this, the law is on our side, and the truth is my witness. The courtroom went silent. You could hear a pin drop in the back row. Then the lawyer continued, revealing a series of maps Grandpa had drawn decades ago, filed with the county, including detailed pasture boundaries that proved every inch of the land was ours, cattle ownership records that predated HOA incorporation, a formal easement guaranteeing access to all shared roads, documented long before any HOA expansion. The HOA president's face changed. First confusion, then disbelief, then panic. The confident smile evaporated as the layers of evidence were exposed. Every claim they had made, abandonment, noncompliance, operational risk, crumbled under Grandpa's careful planning. My lawyer turned the envelope like a weapon of truth. Your Honor, he said, this isn't merely a legal matter. This is a legacy. These documents prove beyond doubt that the HOA has no jurisdiction here and that any actions taken against my client were unauthorized and illegal. A murmur ran through the room. The judge leaned forward, reading the evidence with a frown that deepened with every page. One by one, the HOA lawyers shuffled papers, trying to find a loophole. But there was none. Grandpa's foresight was meticulous, unassailable. The crowd reacted quietly at first, then the whispers grew. Neighbors leaned closer, realizing that the family they had watched being bullied for weeks had the law and the truth firmly on their side. Some reached for their phones, not to record another conflict, but to capture a moment of justice unfolding. The HOA president attempted to speak. She tried to claim ignorance, misfiling, oversight. My lawyer stopped her with a simple line. All of this was publicly filed and registered decades ago. Ignorance is no defense when deliberate actions were taken against rightful ownership. Sweat appeared at her hairline. Hands fidgeted. Her entire presence shrank as the courtroom collectively absorbed the reality she had overreached. She had humiliated a family for years, and now the law, guided by the careful planning of the man she thought she could erase from memory, was dismantling her control. Then came the final line from Grandpa's words, read aloud slowly by the lawyer, resonating through the silent room. Truth cannot be silenced. Greed cannot override history. Let this record stand as a shield for my family, and let those who act without justice beware the weight of what they ignore. You could feel it. The room shifted. The HOA president's smug confidence was gone. The judge paused, letting the words sink in. Even the contractors who had been on our land days before looked embarrassed, uncertain what authority they had actually been serving. This twist, the revelation of Grandpa's final words and the irrefutable evidence, turned the entire courtroom upside down. The people who had expected a routine rubber stamp in favor of HOA authority were now witnesses to something far larger, a legacy of preparation, justice, and the undeniable truth that sometimes silence is the most powerful weapon of all. By the end of the reading, the room was not just quiet, it was transformed. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel anger. I felt the weight of everything Grandpa had protected for me and the overwhelming clarity that this fight was about to turn in our favor. The HOA had demanded the land, the cattle, and the keys. They had thought the man was gone. But Grandpa's final words had arrived, louder, sharper, and unbreakable. And now, the law would speak. The courtroom was electric. Not the kind of energy that comes from shouting or chaos, but the tension that presses against your chest, making every heartbeat echo. Everyone knew this was the turning point. The HOA president sat frozen, staring at the maps, affidavits, and letters that had just been read aloud. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced with a flicker of panic she couldn't hide. My lawyer rose slowly, folding his hands, and addressed the judge. Your Honor, The evidence submitted proves beyond any doubt that my client is the lawful owner of this land, the livestock, and the associated property rights. The HOA has no jurisdiction and all prior attempts to seize or control these assets are void. The judge's eyes narrowed. Mr. Thompson, he said to the HOA lawyer, your organization filed claims of abandonment and noncompliance. How do you respond to these documents? The HOA lawyer shuffled papers, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Your Honor, some of these filings may predate the HOA, but... the judge interrupted, voice sharp, final. These documents are public records. Filed, notarized, and recognized by the county decades ago. Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. A murmur ran through the room. I caught glimpses of the neighbors' faces, shock, relief, and pride. Even the contractors who had been moving equipment days earlier looked ashamed, finally understanding that they had been serving an illegitimate authority. The judge leaned back, scanning the HOA president. Madam, you personally signed off on these actions against Mr. Carter's family. Did you ever review the county filings? Her lips quivered. I assumed. Assumed, the judge repeated, voice cold as steel. You assumed authority over property that did not belong to you. You publicly humiliated and financially threatened the rightful owners. Do you understand the gravity of your actions? She swallowed, silence her only reply. The room was still. The judge's gavel hovered over the desk like a sword ready to strike. My lawyer then asked to read the final line from Grandpa's affidavit again. Truth cannot be silenced. Greed cannot override history. Let this record stand as a shield for my family, and let those who act without justice beware the weight of what they ignore. The words echoed through the courtroom. I could see the president's hands shake. Her staff whispered among themselves. She looked like a figure crumbling under the weight of her own arrogance. Then came the verdict. The judge's voice boomed. Based on the evidence, the historical filings, and the affidavit of Mr. Carter's late grandfather, this court rules that the HOA has no authority over the land, the livestock, or the associated structures. Any fines, notices, or attempts to seize property are hereby null and void. Furthermore, the HOA is ordered to compensate the Carter family for legal costs and any damages caused by their unlawful actions. A collective gasp filled the room. I felt the weight lift off my shoulders. The cattle grazing outside my land could never have sensed it, but I could. They were safe, as they always should have been. The judge didn't stop there. Let this serve as a warning. Power does not lie in intimidation or coercion. It lies in truth, in preparation, and in law. The HOA's actions violated both the letter and the spirit of justice. This court will not tolerate such overreach again. The gavel struck. Hard. Final. Irreversible. The HOA president slumped into her seat, defeated. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, neighbors standing to shake my hand, journalists scribbling notes furiously, and even a few HOA members muttering apologies to no one in particular. I walked outside after the hearing, the sun hitting the pasture in a warm glow. The cattle were calm, grazing as though they sensed the victory. My lawyer clapped me on the shoulder. Your grandfather knew what he was doing, he said. He planned for every eventuality. I looked at the envelope in my hands, now empty but still heavy with memory. Every line Grandpa wrote, every map, every note, it had protected us when we couldn't fight alone. His final words weren't just instructions. They were a weapon, a shield, and a lesson. The HOA president left the courthouse quickly, head down, the arrogance that had carried her stripped bare. Her team followed silently, knowing the story of this defeat would follow them for years. Neighbors began approaching, shaking my hand, offering congratulations, recounting what they had witnessed over the weeks of intimidation. Some confessed they had feared speaking up. Some admitted they had quietly cheered when we stood firm. All of them now understood that power without justice is fragile, temporary, and ultimately self-destructive. As the sun set over the land Grandpa had protected, I realized something profound. This fight was never about proving I was right. It was about proving that preparation, patience, and truth could overcome even the most aggressive abuse of power. The gavel's echo lingered in my mind. The land, the cattle, the keys, they were ours. Justice had been served. And for the first time in weeks, I felt an unshakable peace. Grandpa had anticipated everything. He had planned for silence to speak louder than threats. And today, his final words had done exactly that. The HOA signs came down that week. Their trucks disappeared from the dirt road. The locks were replaced with the ones my grandfather had installed years ago, and the cattle wandered freely, unaware of the legal storm that had raged over their heads. Neighbors stopped by, some quietly apologizing for doubting us, others offering congratulations. There was a shared understanding now, a respect for what my family had endured and a recognition that power only lasts when it goes unchecked. Grandpa's name was spoken often, not just with pride, but with gratitude. His careful planning, his foresight, and his dedication had protected more than land. He had preserved justice itself. I walked the pastures alone one evening, sunlight brushing the grass, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. Every fence, every barn board, every tree felt alive with his memory. He had prepared for every eventuality, foreseen every threat, and left us not just land, but the tools to defend it. This story wasn't just about property. It was a reminder: greed and intimidation might try to take what's ours, but truth, preparation, and courage always have the final word. Grandpa's legacy wasn't just in deeds and maps, it was in the principle that justice can never be stolen. And today, justice had won.